So today, of course, is the 18th Sunday of Ordinary Time. We're a little over halfway through the 34 Sundays, weeks of Ordinary Time. But sometimes, as you know, I like to kind of pick the feast that we fall on, even though we don't celebrate today's feast, because Sunday trumps that, of course. We can learn from them, and particularly coming from England, a significant connection. So July 31st is the feast of St. Ignatius of Loyola. And not only significant for us because, remember, Pope Francis is the first Jesuit, the order that St. Ignatius founded, the first Jesuit to be a pope. So that's certainly always a connection and good moment to excuse to pray for the Pope, so to speak, and the Jesuits. But even more so, got to see the impact of the early work of the Jesuits on our pilgrimage in England. That was one of the graces and really that I grew to appreciate. So they were founded in 1540 by St. Ignatius, and by the 1580s, one of their missions became England. And at that point, if you remember, Catholicism had been basically illegalized, or it was certainly illegal to be a priest, punishable by death to help a priest. And you had to pay a fine if you didn't participate in the Church of England, the Anglican Church. So these were periods of great persecution. And in the midst of that, the Jesuits are sent to try to keep the faith alive in England. It's kind of a crazy story thinking that this, we think of this kind of persecution in the first years, 300 years of our church and with the Roman Empire, but now kind of in modern history, so to speak, in the West, in a first world country, we see the church persecuted as intensely. But these Jesuits that would obviously go into the den of the lion and risk their lives. And it's interesting, so this happens to be the Jesuit order also in this context. One of their own was to accomplish what Time magazine would call one of the 10 greatest escapes from prison, in history. Fun fact. So his name, Father John Gerard, was one of the Jesuits that was imprisoned first in a different part of London, but then eventually in the London Tower. And he was able to figure out a way to escape. They say one of only 2 people to ever escape from the Tower of London. And so then he was able to tell his story. And he worked in England for about 16 years, 4 or 5 of which he was imprisoned, and again escaped from the Tower of London. Eventually, I think in 1606, he had to leave England because the persecutions intensified, etc., and he ended up spending the rest of his years in Rome and elsewhere. But for 16 years, he labored in those fields, and he writes this autobiography. So it's the best account of what was going on in England, in the Catholic Church in these days. And really to hear the things he was willing to risk, the times he had to hide in priest holes. Again, most of the Catholic manors would build these priest holes so that the priest could hide if they were come upon by the authorities and a search was conducted. He had to hide in those multiple times, one time for 4 days without food, another time for 9 days, even though he was able to get food. He eventually, again, was captured. He was tortured in the Tower of London. We know some of the crazy stuff there and the suffering that he would endure. But through all of this, he continued to want to bring the faith, and he did a fantastic job, really, in helping to help the church not only be sustained, but grow. He brought many converts over to the Catholic Church. He sent multiple men back off to study to become Jesuits. It's so really heroic, and all of them did this kind of work, the Jesuits in England at this time. Father Edmund Campion is actually probably the most famous one. He was a saint, one of the first to be martyred in that context. But you say, like someone like a Father John Gerard, he was born into wealth. He very well could have even just chosen to be Catholic in England and kind of maneuver and make it work. Or he could have chosen to, which many of the English did, become Anglican. Just kind of take the easy route, the path of least resistance. And certainly have accomplished much, which the wealth and the name that he had, we know how much in the English kind of political world and cultural world, that name was so much your family and what you gained and your wealth. But he walked away from all of that to give his life in service to maintaining the Catholic Church in persecuted England. Remember, that persecution really go on for 300 years till the mid-1800s. Really, the martyrdoms ended around the mid-1600s. But Christianity or Catholicism wasn't allowed to be reestablished with churches and dioceses until the mid-1800s in England. I kind of didn't know the fullness of that story. But nonetheless, the John Gerards, the Jesuits that were willing to really embrace the message we heard in the readings. You can't, this idea of turning our gaze to heaven, to giving our life to building up and the treasure in heaven, and not for earthly gain and possessions and things here. And it's a constant, battle that we all kind of live out, because that inclination, that fallen human nature of ours is inclined to want to accumulate, to possess, to gain in earthly ways. And so again, if we're not intentional and deliberate about choosing not to focus on that and really turning our gaze to heaven, turning our gaze to what the treasures that are being built in heaven. We know that the Jesuits in England were not accumulating treasures here on earth. In fact, you could argue that they were failing, right? Maybe Father John Gerard was a unique exception where he was helping the church be sustained and maybe even grow, but most of the time they were failing. And yet they were building up an incredible store of treasure in heaven in those efforts of the church. And so they're a great example to us of the message that we hear in the gospel today, and hopefully one that recognizes to put all of our energy into things of this life is vanity. It's vanity of vanities, because of the reality that we don't keep anything, we take nothing with us, right? And this idea that Jesus reinforces that it's the things that are important to God that are the things we should recommit ourselves to and growing in and gaining here on earth, as opposed to the things that are important to men. So every Mass, we come back to kind of recommit ourselves to that, to look at how have I done with this in the past week? How have I done with not being too attached with my earthly life and my earthly possessions? And really, how am I doing at focusing on the eternal and the treasure that I'm building in heaven? And so, once again, on this 18th Sunday of Ordinary Time, on this what would normally be the Feast of St. Ignatius of Loyola, as we're inspired by the Jesuits and what they've done, not just in England, but throughout the 500 years of their history, that we can be renewed in our focus, not here on earth, but our focus to the eternal in heaven. And once again, recommit ourselves to living for that treasure, and that ultimately that treasure alone.